An often under-discussed aspect of French power in the early modern period is that there were a lot of French people. Today, the nation is outpopulated by Russia, Germany and Britain. But for most of the early modern period, France was the most populous European state, with only the continent-spanning Ottoman Empire being the exception. This began to change after the Napoleonic Wars. Before, the nation was around equal in population to the Russian Empire. By 1815, this had already decreased to 2/3 of Russia. Still, they remained the title of second most populous state, until, in 1820, Austria eclipsed France too. Year after year, their relative population kept declining. When Germany was formed, it only had 5 million more people than France. On the verge of World War I, it had 25 million more people. That's an insane growth rate. In a little over a century, France went from being arguably the most populous to only number 5, behind Russia, Germany, Austria, and Britain. Now, there are several reasons for this, one of which is simply war. During the Napoleonic Wars, the nation lost about 20% of their male population, obviously causing a huge demographic burden post-war. But this also applied in lesser scale to other great powers, and it cannot be the full story. Another factor is French inheritance law. In 1805, a new law was signed which forced a father's inheritance to not just pass everything to the eldest son, but divide it between all sons. This might sound like a great, fair law, but most farmers just didn't have that much land, and having it divided in 2, 4, or 6 portions basically guarantees that the increasing amount of families cannot sustainably live there. This succession law essentially turned sons into potential economic disasters, and thereby drove down birth rates. Even that is not the full story, as population growth in France started declining way earlier. A final, often cited reason is French liberalism and secularism. French society was at the forefront of the Enlightenment, and research has shown that the more religious French provinces enjoyed higher birth rates than the more secular one. Now, whatever the specific reason, fact is, across this period, the nation fell behind their European rivals, which had significant effect on their economy and their military potential across this period. Today, we're going to ask an interesting question. What if this French population decline just never happened? Of course, we can't really give a good explanation for this, as the reasons for the decline are too complicated and deep-rooted in French history. So, we will just say, it happens, and leave it at that. Now, let me first show you what exactly I mean. Here is a chart of France's, Britain's, and Prussia-Germany's population across this period. As we can see, French population growth greatly lags behind both Germany and Britain, even if we remove German unification from the trend lines. So, if we give France population growth similar to Germany, France ends the century with more than twice their historical population, remaining decisively ahead of their rival. But, going with a less extreme hypothetical, if we give France Britain's population growth, that would still end them up at 60 million, comfortably ahead of their peers. Considering the German population growth is higher, that is the rate we will be following, as it would lead to the biggest and most radical changes, ensuring France easily remains the Western European nation with the largest population. Now, we will also only start increasing France's population after 1820. While they started their relative decline sooner, the effects of war on population are felt more heavily before this point. And if we started their rise earlier, we'd have to contend with a Napoleonic France with significantly more people, possibly even leading to his victory, by which point the scenario gets distracted from look, France has more people, to Napoleon colonizes Europe with Frenchmen. Another issue is, if we do start this early, German growth rates would result in a France with 140 million people and 110 million with British rates, which for context gives France a similar amount of people as all of Russia by 1900. I do think that may just be a little bit extreme. As a final note before diving into the scenario, the model already takes immigration into account, and thus, we will be assuming that France has similar immigration rates as Germany. Of course, at the start of the timeline, very little changes. If you know math, you will know that the compounding effect causes the biggest changes later on. In the first couple decades, France is just France. Best case, just a little bit more populous and a little bit more industrialized. Nothing crazy, barely a noticeable increase in France's overall power. But this does raise the question, is this increased population enough to fundamentally reshape French society? This period in our timeline was quite tumultuous, with a revolution in 1830 and 1848, as well as the seizure of power by Napoleon III. The addition of this many people and workers could fundamentally change the economic conditions leading to these events. Yet, whether it does is impossible to answer realistically, as it's incredibly broad considering the butterfly effect. So, let's for now pause the discussion on France's internal politics and try to root ourselves more to our own timeline. Have we changed enough to alter the Franco-Prussian War? Or alternatively, is this France sufficiently changed to alter the geopolitics leading up to the event? During our timeline's Franco-Prussian War, the two parties had roughly the same population. In this timeline, France would have maintained at least a 10 million advantage. This would greatly change the calculation for war and might even result in a peaceful solution, war being avoided altogether. It might also result in the French feeling confident in an intervention to save Austria. It might result in France pulling an upset and defeating the Prussians. But considering Germany's many other advantages in the war, it could also still result in the Germans overrunning France anyways. Really, which one it is impossible to tell. So, we will explore two scenarios today. One where France does win the war, and one where Germany wins, despite us strengthening France. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Let's start with the French victory timeline. France annexes significant Prussian territories, most notably including key coal mines, thereby for the first time making French industry self-reliant. It is even possible that after this victory, France purchased Luxembourg as previously planned, though by this point, the great powers would start to become uncomfortable with the rise of France, and therefore might sabotage this sale. Either way, France is greatly empowered. Prussia loses their influence over southern Germany, and we can see France really solidify their position on the continent once again. We have now already massively warmed the timeline, mostly in favor of France, but also, this is where their bigger population really starts to come into play, which is also what divides this scenario from normal France wins the Franco-Prussian War scenarios. In 1875 in our timeline, Germany had millions more people than France. In this timeline, France already has 10 million more people, and that would be assuming they fight a united Germany, which doesn't exist. By 1900, this alternate France would have a 14 million advantage over Germany, and again, that's assuming a unified Germany. Around the time where World War I started in our timeline, France would have 16 million more people than Germany, more than twice the population in our timeline. Adding to that population overmight, we now add a disunited Germany, a France on the Rhine, with ample access to coal to fuel their industry. In the same way that in our timeline, Germany slowly became seen as a European-wide threat, after the Franco-Prussian War, France would find itself surrounded by quite a few powers distrustful over their fast rise. Now, in the same way, during this time period, we like to see Germany as an industrial and economic behemoth. And of course, they were, while assuming that the France cannot really compete. This, however, is only a partial story. Yes, the German economy was nearly twice as big as the French, and in terms of industry, they did have the French beat in many places, but in terms of per capita GDP, the two economies were actually rather similar. Germany just had a lot more people. This alternate France, with great access to industrial resources, with a larger population, would likely be even wealthier. Easily the second biggest economy in Europe, only behind Britain and the Americans. We'd see an alternate France, which is far more industrial, going toe-to-toe with Britain, providing far more scientists, mathematicians and chemists, fields dominated by the Germans and Anglos in our timeline. France remains a giant, technologically and industrially. The future of such a timeline is completely different. Bismarck could be discredited, and rather than becoming a huge continental threat, Northern Germany is only the fourth most powerful great power, maybe even the fifth if Austria gets their act together, while France takes the place that Germany occupied in our timeline. Except, France might be an even more powerful threat to Britain than the Germans were in our timeline. For one, France is nicely tucked away in the west, protected by mountains, oceans, and a bunch of neutral or too weak states surrounding them. In reality, there's only one direction that France really has to worry about. Even worse for Britain, France is actually a colonial threat in a way that Germany never was. France is also right across the English Channel, has a far stronger naval tradition, and, importantly, France mostly had better diplomacy than Wilhelm II did. Don't get me wrong, Napoleon III wasn't perfect, and he had his flaws, but his main flaw was really not recognizing and acting on the threat of Prussia, or at the very least, not making sure he was compensated for their rise. But at the very least, he maintained mostly decent relations with most of the great powers, while Germany under Wilhelm II very directly ruined relations with most of their great power peers, leaving them not quite the biggest list of allies. So, for example, while Britain is concerned about French power, Napoleon III was extremely mindful of Britain across his reign. The idea that he so implicitly challenges them into a naval arms race in the way that Germany tried to seems quite unlikely. France is a lot freer in their diplomacy than Germany was, with their self-paranoid rhetoric of encirclement and their extensive dreams of expansion. France has fewer direct enemies, only Northern Germany really being a permanent enemy, and fewer radical desires for expansion. That is not to say that France doesn't have any expansionist goals, they very much do, but they are far less irreconcilable with the other great powers. France mostly has their desired borders. France is safe. France has a significant place in the sun. There is no more powerful European rival, no encirclement. France is free to pick and choose their eastern partners in whatever way fits them, and are far more likely to keep Britain at least partially neutral. Obviously, the specifics of their diplomacy are impossible to tell, and it would really depend on a lot of factors we cannot specifically predict, especially since we might have also removed Bismarck, the great European peacemaker. We mostly remember the failures of Wilhelm II's foreign policy, but Bismarck was a huge force in a number of areas, like intervening in the Balkans, organizing the Berlin Conference, setting up for the colonization of Africa, and all of this might be erased now too. This might very well impact how certain events change, especially in the Balkans, while in Africa, it might lead to a more chaotic scramble for the continent, with most notably, the Germans not really being involved. They aren't really in a position to focus as much on naval and colonial matters. They might still get token territories, but I don't expect anything much. This scramble for Africa, though, is also where Britain starts truly becoming afraid of France, as they are now the only real competitor for influence in Africa, and France would at the very least attempt to steal Sudan away from Britain, though their success is very unlikely. This leads me to believe that in a milder form, Britain and France would mirror the competition of Germany and Britain of our timeline, though the competition changes drastically based on one single factor. As the Ottoman Empire crumbles, does France side with the Ottoman Empire and Austria, standing against Russia, or do they switch towards the Russian? With Napoleon III in power, that decision is easily made. His biggest symbolic victory had been defending the Ottomans against the Russians. And for their part, the Russians did not trust Napoleon, partially because of his defense of the Ottomans, but also partially because Russia believed France supported the Polish rebellions against them. Yet, by 1870, Napoleon III was an ill man. He would not last another decade. It would be up to his son to determine the future of France. We know Napoleon IV was not a liberal man, siding with reactionary parties within France, but his opinions on foreign policies are not as clear. For that reason, I do believe he would mostly follow his father's policy, aligning with Austria-Hungary against the northern Germans and aligning against the Russians in the east. If I had to guess, a Franco-Austrian alliance across the southern German states against the North Germans and Russians seems quite possible, with Britain having no reason to take a clear stance on either, opposed to letting either of them come out on top on the continent. In such a world, I'm not even sure that there would be a world war. North Germany is in no way strong enough to confront France on their own, especially with Austria in their back too. The collapse of the Ottomans would be the most likely tension point, but even then, it is unlikely that if Russia starts an aggressive European war over the Ottoman Empire, that Britain would intervene on their side. Of course, I might be completely wrong. This is merely a broad analysis from which we do not know the details. But the way I see it, France, Austria and the Ottomans are the stronger continental faction. If they start a war, Britain likely joins against them, and I'd bet strongly on them to lose. Bad plan. Conversely, again, I don't think Russia and northern Germany would be strong enough to go to war by themselves. I unironically think that there is a significant chance that the additional strength we gave France, assuming they don't mess it up by alienating Britain like Wilhelm II did, makes for a far stronger balance of power in Europe. Would it last forever? Nothing can. But any form of World War I might happen significantly later, or not even be considered a world war. By this point though, I am so deep into speculation that I think it's time to end this particular scenario. But that was just one of the options I wanted to discuss today. I think it would be very interesting if we tried to examine the effects of a stronger France in a timeline closer to our own, where they still lose the Franco-Prussian War, become a republic, and along broad lines, European geopolitics mirror our own. This allows us to much better gauge just how different France is, with so many more people within their nation. The initial post-war decades of France rebuilding wouldn't be too different, but as the great power competition heats up and the core alliances are being established, we really start feeling the differences. By 1900, France would have 27 million extra people compared to our timeline, still outnumbering even the fully united Germany. As mentioned, these extra people aren't just soldiers or numbers. They very much directly translate to a far stronger French industry, science and economy, which has the potential to complicate great power politics. I think the biggest change might be with Germany's perspective on European politics. Their paranoia about the Franco-Russian alliance would be even greater, especially if their relationship with Britain also deteriorates. Even worse, there isn't an easy solution, as I highly doubt that the Schlieffen Plan to first invade France would actually be implemented in this timeline. That battle plan, while fundamentally flawed, only makes sense in a world where Germany is significantly stronger than France. If France, by themselves, is equal if not stronger than Germany, such an attempt would undoubtedly lead to disaster, as Germany gets stuck between two armies larger than itself. How Germany solves this is difficult to say. They might even decide to fortify the border with France, with their battle plans focusing on destroying Russia first. Yet, this isn't a decision that's easily made. If Germany does move to a battle plan in which they go east first, they are explicitly choosing for a long, drawn-out war, as the idea of destroying Russia by Christmas is insanity. Whatever battle plan the Germans pick, any concept of a quick victory within a year is out of the window, quite possibly leading to Germany being more cautious on the world stage, as even misplaced beliefs in German superiority can't stack up to the sheer numbers that France and Russia are putting up. Adding to this, the decision for Britain about which side to support, if any, is far more difficult. They aren't allying a mostly toothless France and a Russia decades away from being a true threat. Instead, they'd have to choose which of the two power blocks they'd like to dominate Europe, while in reality, they of course want neither to. Very possibly, this, combined with a more careful Germany, leads to Britain sitting on the sidelines, making the calculations for war even more difficult, especially for whatever side intends to start the conflict. The largest geopolitical consequence of a France that is almost twice as strong is that the war is far less winnable for the Germans, and who to support is much rougher to decide for Britain. And for those reasons, the odds of war breaking out at all is again much reduced. That is, assuming butterfly effects haven't ruined my analysis. From here, let's conclude with, in my opinion, the three biggest options for the conclusion. The first option is that war doesn't break out at all, which might even be the most likely. The military situation is too close to call, Germany is unable to see a swift victory, and France and Russia delay and delay until they have British consent, which is never coming. Sadly though, and I'm sorry, I will not go into detail on this scenario, as it would be a huge side tangent, easily doubling the length of this video. Don't worry though, I do intend to later this year cover what if World War I was avoided. For this video, we are going to focus on the remaining two options. In both cases, war breaks out. No clue who, where or how, but it does. There is very much a non-zero chance that it is actually France and Russia starting the conflict, believing themselves to be the more powerful faction in the long term. Either way, Britain initially leans on the sidelines, but their support for either side would likely prove decisive. So, let's run through two timelines here. One where Germany wins, and one where France wins. As conflict breaks out, Britain announces armed neutrality while remaining in frantic negotiations with both sides, as well as a variety of neutral nations, urging each of them not to get involved into the war before Britain makes a decision. Germany starts pushing into Russia, while France attempts, but mostly fails, to push into Germany from the west. For Russia to hold out against the Central Powers, it is pretty much required for the Ottomans to not join Germany. If they still do in this timeline, France loses the ability to supply their eastern ally, leading them to fight a losing battle, unable to break the Germans themselves, while the Germans slowly grind down the Russians. It is even possible that, in desperation, France could commit to a move like invading Belgium themselves, in hopes of breaking Germany. Such actions, though, would likely ruin the chances of Britain ever joining them. And while it doesn't immediately mean that Britain joins the Germans, they could start putting economic and diplomatic pressure on the French to end the conflict. As France continues to fail to make progress in the west, while Germany pushes the Russians in the east, I believe it becomes quite possible we see an American-British attempt to conclude the war in some form, in hopes of ending the war before Russia irreversibly collapses. The peace conference is impossible to predict, but I highly doubt that Germany would gain many territories in the west. Funnily enough, it might be possible that the only territory France loses is this area which Belgian nationalists did claim, as Britain might prefer France to have less of a cross-channel presence. On the other side of Europe though, Germany does gain significant Russian territories, and I have great doubts that the Tsarist regime would survive such a loss. Whether Nicholas is replaced by a democratic republic, a socialist republic, a revolution, or some form of dictatorship is too difficult to say. In either case though, Russia is likely in a bad position for the decades following. In Africa, France would likely have to cede some minor territories to Germany as well. And as the peace conference concludes, France is by no means broken. They are still ahead of Germany in terms of population, but they can no longer rely on Russia as their hammer in the east. The outcome of the conflict is relatively positive for Britain, as the Franco-Russian threat has been broken, but Germany is not too powerful. If I had to guess, France and Britain would now start growing closer together after the war, as Britain does have to recognize that Germany is now by far the biggest threat. Yet, in the short term, Britain successfully prevented a single power from fully dominating Europe, at least for now. Now, alternatively, the French could win the war. The easiest way to make this happen is for the Germans to, for some reason, still think that the Schlieffen Plan is a good idea. Of course, there are countless other ways to make the Germans lose, but following this one leads to a timeline closest to our own, which I think is most interesting. Such an invasion immediately alienates Britain because of the invasion of Belgium, and again, while they don't necessarily immediately join the French, they do put sanctions on Germany, and further German actions could easily bring the British into the war. Beyond Britain, the Schlieffen Plan just doesn't do nearly as well as in our timeline, as the French have about twice the population and thus soldiers as in our timeline. Germany has made the crucial mistake. They created for themselves a much larger front line while having to keep more forces in the west than they did in our timeline, while they are outnumbered on both sides. Even if Britain never joins the war, this conflict is extremely winnable for France, as the Germanic states are now in quite the bind. The main question now becomes, can Britain hold the more extreme French and Russian demands back when it does become time for a peace conference in some form? Here it depends on if Britain truly threatens to join the war on the German side. If they don't, France's additional power, assuming Russia hasn't yet collapsed, leads to them not listening to British arguments for why Germany shouldn't be destroyed. Their demands are very clear and unwavering: the reconquest of Alsace, the conquest of the Saarland, and the reorganization of the Rhineland into puppet states. On the other side of Germany, the Russians likewise seize immense territories. There's no doubt about it, Germany was not to continue as a great power post-war, which between France and Russia, both nations now more powerful than it. Even worse, Russia looks to Austria, which starts collapsing on their own, and the Russians take charge in the destruction of the empire, rewarding allies and opportunistic separatist states. Perhaps even trying to enthrone a Russian prince in Czechoslovakia, trying to rewrite Eastern Europe in their image. If this happens, it would seem like Franco-Russian hegemony over Europe is secured. Britain has failed, and they now have two entirely different threats which they need to balance. Now, alternatively, Britain might in this timeline too manage to force a more lenient peace deal on the Central Powers. But the issue with this is that Austria-Hungary cannot just get a mild peace deal and survive. If they fight a big war for a sustained amount of time and then lose it, then there is no doubt in my mind that the empire is going to break apart. So while Britain might manage to prevent a partition of Germany, they are unlikely to prevent the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Of course, all of these options mentioned today are just some examples. It should be clear that with the amount of butterflies introduced in such a world, foreign policy could easily be completely changed in ways I cannot predict. Different leaders, different economic factors, a completely alternate world which I have no hope of predicting in detail. A final scenario I might want to discuss, purely for scientific reasons, I don't think it is actually possible, is a world where World War I ends mostly as it did in our timeline. Again, this wouldn't happen, but imagine the effect that this would have on the world. After their victory, our timeline's France had absolutely no hope or appetite for opposing the Germans on their own, as even after demilitarization, which gave France a huge edge over any conflict, if they would fail to swiftly break Germany and had to fight alone, there was a very good chance of Germany coming out on top long term. This is part of the reason why France relied so much on British support when confronting Germany before World War II. An alternate France, with nearly twice the historical population, could greatly bolster the chance that they unilaterally confront Germany's military buildup before World War II, potentially acting in a far more aggressive manner, preventing World War II in its early stages. Regardless, one thing that would be present in all these scenarios discussed today is that there are more than twice the French people across this period, which will also lead to a far greater French influence across the world. I've already mentioned that France would be more present in industry and science, but I'm also talking about things like emigration to the Americas, which the French in our timeline didn't really do compared to the Germans, Brits, Irish or Italians. This was for a number of reasons, but amongst them was just the lower birth rate and amount of French people, meaning there was less pressure for them to move. We could very well see more French influence across the United States, while the French colonial empire likewise has changed. French people would by no means overrun the natives fully everywhere, but the French diaspora in several colonies could be far bigger, with Algeria specifically having a chance to become significantly French enough it might just be held on to, even in the modern day. For now though, that is about all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different style of video, and thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.